The story of Five Nights at Freddy's is complicated, but it is of my personal belief that we make it complicated. Scott has already told us how to break down the story to digest it easier, only to piece it back together. When Matt Pat had that Fnaf 4 live stream, Scott gave us 3 different images, one of those saying 4 games, 1 story. This is interesting to me because this is Scott basically telling us that the core 4 games are their own story. And now, 7 years later, I am telling you that that quote still stands. In this series, we're going to break down the timeline and put it back together in 3 separate stories. Fnaf 1 to 4, Sister Location to Pizzeria Simulator, and VR to Security Breach Ruin. So we're going to start the timeline off with 1 to 4. This means I'm only going to look at evidence from Fnaf 1 to 4 that we knew at the time. In later entries, I will add on to the timeline, so yes, I am telling you, take some notes. So where do we start off in the timeline? Well, it would have to be Five Nights at Freddy's 4. With this date of 1993, and we also see Springlock suits, we know and see that this diner shuts down after the crying child gets bit by Fredbear. After this, Fazbear Entertainment buys the Fredbear Family Diner Company, and also to note that the crying child most likely possesses Golden Freddy here. Next in the timeline are the Fnaf 3 phone guide tapes. We can deduce that these calls probably take place around 1983 to 1987. In these tapes, Phone Guy talks about the Springlock suits. These tapes probably taking place around Fnaf 4. He then talks about the multiple and simultaneous Springlock failures, thus shutting down the idea of Springlock suits. But this also puts the Springlock failures before the Missing Kids incident, aka the MCI. Because in night 5 and 6, the tapes talk about safe rooms, this taking place either directly after the MCI or somewhere around it. The puppet's death within the information of the first 4 games is weird, in a sense that we don't know a lot about it. Even now, with all the information that we know it takes place before the MCI and after Fnaf 4, but giving an actual year and date is extremely hard. We could assume it takes place around Freddy Fazbear's Diner or at Freddy Fazbear's Diner, but my issue to me is the color of Freddy in the Fnaf minigame. This fan base takes color very seriously, but everybody likes to gloss over the fact that in the minigame, Freddy is brown, which would mean that the puppet's death would have to take place between 1984 and 1985. On January 6th in the year 1985, 5 kids were taken into the back rooms and were lured by a man in a yellow suit. They were stuffed into the 4 costumes and a golden secret 5th costume. The puppet gave life to these suits. This takes place at the Fnaf 1 location, however, Fnaf 1 does not take place here. Let me explain. The Fnaf 1 gameplay does not happen, however, the location Fnaf 1 takes place, this is where the murders happen. Now I'll explain later how I got the 1985 date without using any outside knowledge besides the 4 games, but for just now, just note that I am using in-game logic and in-game information, and also some meta logic at the time. Fnaf 2 takes place in November of 1987. There are a lot of stuff that happens in this game, but we'll get through it. First off, the Fnaf 2 phone calls, unlike the other games, these phone calls actually take place while the game is happening. The only events that are told to us is that there's a second MCI event, the Bite of 87, Mango probably did it, but I'll explain that later, and the closure of the restaurant. Now, these events happen in that order. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that the second MCI happens after the game or before the game. Matter of fact, It happens right before night 6. Now, how do we know the second MCI is even a thing? Well, is it even a second MCI? Here's the thing. Mainly, nobody actually knows kids went missing in this location in the first place. Nobody talks about it. People just note that there was a yellow suit that was used and now the animatronics are acting up. My theory is that the purple guy kidnapped 5 kids and killed them. But we won't know why until sister location. Now on to the bite of 87. First off, let's be honest with ourselves, it was probably either Mangle or Toy Chica. Those are the only animatronics that actually had the means to do it. The withers are inaccessible to the public. Besides Toy Chica and Mangle, there's no other toy animatronics that even has the means to damage someone's forehead and that could be seen as a bite. Now, Toy Chica is iffy because she takes off her beaks and then pushes it. And that kind of pushes the logic of biting. So the only one that makes sense for the whole bite of 87, it had to be Mangle. November 12th of 1990, 1993, 1999, 2004, or 2009 is when Fnaf 1 takes place. Now, I know the popular theory is that Fnaf 1 takes place in 1993, but I beg to differ. Not only is that on the basis of the theory of Game Theory's first video on FNAF, where he says the story of FNAF was based on real Chuck E. Cheese murders. Also, the minimum wage is an iffy subject, because it not only does it differ from state to state, we also know that Fazbear Entertainment is a very scummy company. After all, in the same game about the pay rate, they literally find a legal loophole to get away with murder. So, I'm gonna break the rules real quick and discuss the Silver Eyes, which actually was released 4 months after FNAF 4. The Silver Eyes states that FNAF 1 takes place in Utah, and if we cross-reference, it can't be in 1990 because the minimum wage was $3.80 at the time. It also can't be 2004 or 2009 because that leaves too much money. 1993 and 1999 are the only ones that actually leaves us. And I believe that the actual date of FNAF 1 is 1999. But why, you might ask? Well, Phone Guy in FNAF 2 says that they'll be closed at least for a while. Now, if it took place in 1993, it would only be around 6 years, which is a while. But remember, the FNAF location alone has around 5 murders and a bite. So, it might be more important for FNAF the next location for them to be in 1999, because that would have been 12 years after the murder. After all, kids back in 87 would be adults now, thus safely putting FNAF 1 in the 1999 spot. Keep in mind, the logic I put from the 2004 and 2009 with too much money thing still applies for 1999. Then again, like I said, Fazbear is a scummy company. However, if you believe that FNAF 1 takes place in 1993, this doesn't really hinder the theory as much as it does, and I actually have more reason to believe it's more of a 1995 deal. But yeah, but enough of all that yapping. What actually happens in FNAF 1? Well, not a lot. In order: Phone Guy's death, our playthrough, Fazbear's closure, and Purple Guy's death. Probably. But how does Purple Guy die? Around FNAF 1 and the restaurant is running down in the minigame. Well, look at the FNAF 1 location again. In the minigame, it looks like it's raining, so therefore there has to be holes in the wall. But take a close, and I mean a very close look at the restaurant that we play in. There's cobwebs everywhere. The cameras barely work. Hell, the kitchen camera doesn't work. So obviously, the place is probably very run down. Not only that, but the place shuts down due to odor from the animatronics and also bad publicity. So, I mean, what's to say the place isn't run down enough to have holes in the ceiling by the time Purple Guy comes in? 30 years later, FNAF 3 takes place. But 30 years from what? The MCI, from Purple Guy's death? From what? I'll be honest, I can't give you a date, but then I'd have to explain the date without using security breach, and mainly because the 4 core games, FNAF 3 takes place the latest in the timeline. But if we assume that it's 30 years after FNAF 1, it would take place in the year 2029. Or, if it takes place 30 years after FNAF 2, it would take place in 2017. Or, if it took place with 30 years from the original MCI, which happened in between 1983 and 1987. Okay, fine. I'll say that the MCI takes place in 1985, but I'm not going to break any rules in explaining it. FNAF 3 releases in 2015, which actually would be 30 years since 1985. Scott likes to be meta, so FNAF 3 being a horror attraction that takes nostalgia and makes it horror is the same thing that FNAF 3 as the game does. So there, I'm not breaking any of my rules. Also, by now, within the core 4 games, Scott is already meta. First of all, we see his pictures in FNAF 4. And Scott likes to state that people said, oh, I must have put a bunch of random Easter eggs this time. I didn't when talking about FNAF 4. In the trailer for FNAF 3, it says 30 years later, but it never specifies when. What if it's talking about 30 years before the current year, 2015? Boom. Thus, the order of FNAF 3 would be our gameplay, Happiest Day, FNAF 3 Fire, and Springtrap Living. The story of FNAF 3 is quite simple. The player, throughout the week, helps the spirits create the happiest day for Golden Freddy, and after that is assumed that we caused the FNAF 3 fire. However, which Golden Freddy? Because there are 2, and yes, you can figure this out before sister location. The first clue is that Golden Freddy might have 2 souls is the fact that in FNAF 2, he seems to have 2 forms, a slumped over Freddy and a giant head Freddy. And you can't really say it's hallucinations because both Jeremy and Michael see Golden Freddy, and maybe even William. Not only that, Golden Freddy is the only animatronic up to FNAF 4 to have 2 souls die in or near him. Now, in hindsight, we know that Crying Child is the one to be set free in Happiest Day. However, we can figure this out as well. In the minigame, if you flip it over, it is the FNAF 4 Fredbear layout. But there is still one question I haven't answered. Who do we play as in FNAF 3? Well, it's Mike Schmidt. Not only that, Mike Schmidt is Foxy Bro and Fritz Smith. But Isaiah, Mike Schmidt is Michael Afton, and you'd only figure that out if you read the Silver Eyes. Well, here's the thing. We could have figured this out that Mike was the main character before Pizzeria Simulator, before Sister Location. Remember, we could figure out that CC was Golden Freddy. And this was the main point of evidence. Golden Freddy's catchphrase is weird, isn't it? It's me. Now, you might assume that this is to the killer. However, it's me is very specific. Me means one, not it's us. Remember us? No, it's not a plural thing. Whenever we see Golden Freddy, it's me. And not only that, now that we know that Golden Freddy has 2 souls, it's me doesn't make sense anymore. If there's 2 souls, wouldn't it be it's us? Or it's us, remember us? It should be a plural thing. It's me is referring to one character, and knowing that Michael Schmidt was the main character in every game, we can then assume that Michael Schmidt has a good enough reason to go to every game. As a matter of fact, I am going to double down. Mike Schmidt is Michael Afton's preferred name, but that is a theory for another day. I don't know where to put this, but we do know that free roaming animatronics from 1993 to 1987 were a thing. This could explain why Mango is still active in the Save Them minigame. Remember, Mango did get jumped by a bunch of kids, so her code could be screwed up. Didn't know where else to put this in the video, just wanted to mention here. And that is the first entry of the Twisted. Next, we're going to talk about sister location in Fnaf World and how that affects the timeline. And till then, see you later.